Well, hello everyone. I was going to say good morning, but I know you're from all over, so maybe it's not morning where you are. I'm Vicki Dickerson, and I'm the person who moderates these webinars and have been organizing them for Family Process for the last, I think about 8 months. And they've been very successful, and we're happy to have you with us for Joe Freedman and Jean Combs' presentation today. Let me do a little housekeeping before I introduce them. You folks are all in listen only, and you will be throughout the webinar, which means you can hear it and you can see it. But if you want to ask a question, the best way to ask that question is go to the control panel that should be on your screen and type a question into the question box. Those questions will be collected by Christopher Burke, who's our organizer today. Jason is also on the line. Jason Black is also on the line. So we have 2 people helping us out. And I'll collect those questions, or Chris will collect those questions and show them to me. So Jill and Jean will present for about an hour, and then they're telling me 45 minutes. And then in the last part of this webinar, I will ask them the questions that you send on to me, and we'll have a conversation about what you're interested in. In the last 5 minutes or so, I will show you how to access the article that Jill and Jean have written for Family Process, and also another article that will be unlocked and available to all of you for 30 days. So I think with that being said, I think I've said what I needed to say. Let me introduce Joe Freedman and Jean Combs. These 2 people are very good friends of mine. I've known them for a very long time, which is quite nice to have them in my life. Jill is the director of the Evanston Family Therapy Center. I've been at that center. Jill and Jean do a tremendous amount of teaching. And at that center, they have intensives in narrative therapy and also a year-long program. And I think if you're not on their email list, you should look at their website. Is your website evanstonfamilytherapycenter.com? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
No, it's it's narrativetherapychicago.com.
Oh, narrativetherapychicago.com. So you should look at their website.
We'll put that up at the end of our presentation. We'll show contact information.
Perfect. And I know they just got back from Tuscany, and they did an intensive there earlier, I guess, end of May, right? That's when you did an intensive there.
That's right.
So, and Jill also travels and teaches internationally. She's spent some time in China. Jean has joined her there, and I think she's going to be in China a lot in July, correct?
That's right.
So Jean is the associate clinical professor in the departments of psychiatry and family medicine at North Shore University Health System, which is an affiliate of the University of Chicago. Together, they have co-authored Narrative Therapy, the Social Construction of Preferred Realities, and I will show you that. People have said that if you want a manual for narrative therapy, that you can find it here. It's a very popular book. It still has a lot of readership, and they've also written over 30 articles and book chapters on narrative therapy, and they have another book called Narrative Therapy with Couples, and a whole lot more. They've done. I've seen their work with couples. I think I would encourage you to take a look at that book. They also have a chapter in Al Gurman's Clinical Handbook of Couple Therapy, and that's an excellent chapter on narrative therapy with couples. So with that being said, there's a whole lot more I could say about them, but I want you to listen to their presentation. So with that being said, I'm turning it over to them, and Jill and Jean, I'm looking forward to this. It's all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Vicki, for inviting us and for all of the interwoven ways that our work and our lives have come together. It's all been very significant and additive. So we're happy to join this endeavor, which we know you've worked so hard on. So thank you for that. And also thanks to Chris and Jason for hopefully making this go smoothly today. Okay, so we're going to talk and tell you some stories and hopefully give you some ideas about what narrative therapy is all about. So at a conference some years ago, we met a physician from New York. The time was early in the AIDS epidemic when a diagnosis of AIDS was a death sentence. The physician had watched countless young men enter his hospital to live out their final days. These men were almost always surrounded and supported by friends and partners. The physician had gone to many funerals, and at those funerals, the friends and partners who had so lovingly cared for the dying men were relegated to the back of the room. When the biological families of these young men, who had rarely appeared during their hospital stays, laid claim to their bodies, they took the places in front. They gave the eulogies. Strange and sad to the physician was how these stories ended at about the age of 14, before the deceased had publicly claimed sexual identities. Although the partners and friends of the men could recognize these stories that were spoken at the funeral, the physician said that he was pretty sure that they did not recognize the people with the sexless, truncated lives that those stories described. We found the physician's words distressing and also intriguing. As practitioners of narrative therapy, we thought about the physician's experience as an illustration of the narrative metaphor in action. It shows how people's identities are defined and constructed through stories. It illustrates the power involved in being in the position to decide which stories will be told and retold and which will not. It shows how the sharing and circulation of different stories contributes to building different communities. It illustrates how stories give meaning to lives and relationships, privileging some people in relationships and making others invisible. So we had a conversation with the physician in which we shared some of these thoughts. And he smiled and said, but now more and more men are composing their own videos of their lives to be shown at their funerals. We found this development encouraging. For us, it illustrates how people can assert a position as privileged authors of their own lives.
We want to begin today with a tiny bit of history and then move quickly into an overview of some things that we think, at least from our point of view, make narrative therapy distinctive for us. This is a picture of the originators of narrative therapy. Michael White on the left, David Epstein on the right, taken sometime, we think, in the early 80s, before narrative therapy was even called narrative therapy. And back in those days, they were talking about a central idea of why they were drawn to each other's work that they wanted to be sure was carried forward into however these ideas evolved. And we think that's still a central part of narrative work. And I just want to read you a quote from back then. One of the aspects associated with this work that is of central importance to us is the spirit of adventure. We aim to preserve this spirit and know that if we accomplish this, our work will continue to evolve in ways that are enriching to our lives and to the lives of those persons who seek our help. So let's look at some things that Jill and I at least think are distinctive about narrative therapy and attractive to us. We think the idea that the person is not the problem is the problem, may be the thing that this work is most widely known for. And we'll come back and talk about each of these points in more detail as we go through. We're going to spend some time looking at the metaphor of narrative instead of the metaphor of systems or cybernetics, looking more at stories and not so much at machines, looking at how things evolve according to a plot over time and not just as circles of mindless interaction.
We know that the metaphor of systems is really different for different people, and I think that the narrative metaphor was that Michael and David were thinking about some of the machine metaphors of systems when they were coming up with a different metaphor.
Right. We think that narrative looks at the cultural, social, and political contributions to problems in a more detailed and more central way than lots of other approaches to therapy does. We think that therapy can include noticing and supporting acts of resistance and refusal of problematic ideas. One of the things I like about that picture of Michael and David is it puts me back in touch when I look at it with my roots in sort of the protest movements of the 60s. And we think that this work carries a spirit of useful subversion of dominant ideas in the culture.
I know that when I learned to do therapy, the emphasis was more on adjusting to a situation. And so there's this refreshing attitude about noticing when people are doing things in their own ways and wondering if it's a resistance and a refusal of a particular idea that actually can speak to things that are more important to the particular person or couple or family.
We think that narrative therapy was one of the first therapies that was really looking at how therapy has to be different to fit for different cultures. I think the notion of tailoring things to cultures has become more widespread, but it's still very central in narrative and thinking of each person as a member of a culture and how do you need to tailor the stories that they're telling so that it fits with that culture but isn't dominated by ideas that they don't agree with in that culture as well. Narrative therapy is a therapy of questions, not answers. We don't have canned answers that we try to give to people or formulas that we follow, and our main tool is really asking questions.
And I think it's not just that we don't have, it's more that we're thinking about the expertise is in the experience of particular people and families, so that by asking questions we can draw that out instead of thinking about an expert answer.
And that relates to this last thing we're wanting to talk about a very collaborative therapy relationship. We want to minimize the hierarchy, and we want the voices that have the most say in therapy to be the voices of the people that have come to consult with us. This slide, we hope, shows a little bit about how we try to position ourselves as therapists. In terms of being influential, we do want to have an influence in people's lives, but we don't want to be the person that the light shines on in the therapy. We don't want to be centered, and we don't want our ideas and values to be central to the therapy. We want to decenter our values, ideas, and things and shine the light on what people want, but we want to be influential in helping them realize those things in their lives.
So we want to talk a little bit more about the narrative metaphor. As narrative therapists, we believe that people give meaning to their lives and relationships through stories. If you can imagine that each of the dots on the screen represents a life experience. And of course, we could keep making dots and dots and dots, whether this is the life experience of a couple or a family or an individual. But when someone consults with a therapist, they're usually caught up in a very thin story of their life that only includes a few of those many life experiences. Each member of a family may talk about those same experiences and have different meanings, or they may relate different stories that focus on different experience and carry different meanings. As therapists, we think our first job is to listen, to understand their stories, but to orient to them knowing that there are many, many, many experiences that lie outside of those problematic stories, that this is a very small sample of their life. And when we listen in this way, we're able to notice when people make a reference, either explicitly or implicitly, to something that wouldn't be predicted have told and retold and perhaps rehearsed to tell the therapist that at the time that they're consulting, speak to them of what they think is possible for their life. So once we notice something that wouldn't be predicted by a problematic story, we can go on to ask questions to invite people to step into this event and to tell us, and themselves more importantly, about it, so that that develops into a meaningful story. Once they're experientially involved in a story that lies outside of the problematic story, we can ask about related events and the meaning of those events, developing them into a memorable and vivid story that stretches into the past and implies a new trajectory for the future. Over time, this process leads to the development of multiple storylines with rich and complex meanings that speak of multiple possibilities for people's lives. One thing that I find really interesting is that this process does not take away problematic stories, but if we're looking at from the vantage point of all these multiple storylines, the problematic storyline, which is still in there, looks really different as just one small strand of story. So our main purpose in narrative therapy is to develop rich stories, stories that immerse people in the experience of alternative, preferred possibilities for their lives. When people can experience their lives inside of these richer, more complex stories, they have new perspectives, new experiences of what they can be and how they can be.
Now that's a very brief description of the narrative metaphor, and that guides us in all of our work. And keeping that in mind, we want to focus now on 4 interrelated aspects of the narrative worldview. These are that social and historical contexts shape the possibilities we can perceive, that the person is not the problem is the problem, that therapy is a process of meaning making, and that identity is a relational project. Let's start with how social and historical contexts shape the possibilities we can perceive. The stories that people tell, the experiences they select to make meaning of, and tell and retell and reflecting on their lives, aren't selected by chance. There are larger stories that shape the way people interpret their experience. In any social group, we participate in each other's stories. We shape and are shaped by the beliefs, intentions, and actions of others. Collectively, we participate in what we call discourses. Discourse refers to a collection of taken for granted cultural assumptions. The norms and expectations of a culture are communicated through discourses, and these norms and expectations become taken for granted. Unless we look for them, and often even when we do look for them, they're invisible. But even though the discourses are invisible, we measure ourselves against the norms and expectations that we set. For example, gender discourses still often create a set of assumptions in which the man in a heterosexual couple is expected to earn more money than the woman in that couple. This expectation, even if both members of the couple wish to oppose it, often still creates tension if the woman earns more. It seems like it's not normal for the woman to be a big earner, and this makes it hard for each partner to avoid the sense that something's just wrong, not right. Discourse is about the importance of grades and of graduating from a top-ranked university lead to misery for many people that are leading very privileged lives if they've got high school students and they're trying to be useful to those students. A whole other set of discourses around race and class make it hard for young men of color to avoid jail or even to survive into middle age. And this is just some examples of discourses and how they operate. Foucault's notion of modern power is helpful in thinking about how discourses operate in our lives. Foucault contrasted what he called traditional power with modern power. When he's talking about traditional power, he's talking about that more obvious kind of power that comes from kings or popes or people at the top of a hierarchy and is influenced by public things like floggings and executions, or here we have a picture of a man being drawn and quartered, which is a very public display of what can happen if you try to go against traditional power. It's coercive, uses fear and intimidation often. Modern power, instead of coming directly from a central authority, is carried in discourses. It exerts its effects through persuasion and enticement, through lobbying, advertising, participating on school boards, by building impressive headquarters, and lots of other ways. The more privileged people in a society exert more influence on its discourses. We often don't notice this influence, certainly not in the way we would notice a person being drawn and quartered, but modern power recruits us into comparing ourselves to the ideals reflected in dominant discourses. Influenced by the media, by what's readily available at the supermarket, by the standard curriculum for schools, and by the clothes we see on pop stars, just to name a few examples, we tend to accept the dominant norms and discourses. We try to live up to them, comparing ourselves to what they deem good or normal or sexy, and judge ourselves and each other according to these comparisons. We tend to organize our relationships in line with the models that saturate our culture.
Narrative therapists are interested in exposing the workings of modern power so that people can decide if they want to align themselves with the norms portrayed in discourses or with something else. Now, this sounds like a pretty intellectual idea, but hopefully the work in therapy isn't intellectual at all, that it's experience near for people. So I'm just going to tell you my favorite story about deconstructing discourses as a way to illustrate that. So Andy, a young working class man, came to see me because his fourth fiancée had just broken her engagement with him. One of his buddies thought that since this had happened 4 times, he should talk to someone about it. So the second time I met with Andy, I asked if he thought back on what these 4 women had said in breaking up with him, if they all said pretty much the same thing, or if they said different things about the reasons that they were ending the relationship. Andy thought about that for a minute, and then he said, they pretty much all said the same thing. They said that when we were dating, I wined and dined them, but as soon as we got engaged, I spent most of my time with my buddies at the bar or watching sports TV, and I pretty much was only interested in getting together with them for sex. So I asked him, what do you think about that? He just looked at me. So I said, well, would you agree with their description? He nodded. So I asked, does that say something about your perception of women? He looked at me again. I said, well, let me ask you this. Where do you think you might have learned to treat women this way? Wining and dining them first, and then just treating them as a sexual object? Andy thought about this for a while, and just as I was ready to try again with a different question, he said, beer commercials. He went on, because I told him I wasn't really familiar with beer commercials, he went on to explain to me that if you watch sports TV, you see a lot of beer commercials. So I said, well, can you tell me one? And so he described a beer commercial that was on TV at that time. There were these 2 men, he told me, sitting on a deserted beach. Then 2 women in bikinis appear sort of out of nowhere, and suddenly walk by them. The men, at that moment, magically have remote controls in their hands. They press the button, and the women in bikinis walk back in front of them. They hit the buttons again, and the women walk forward in front of them. They hit the buttons, and the women walk back, and so on. That's a beer commercial, Andy said. So when he finished that description, I asked him what he thought about that depiction of women and of relationships. He looked at me. Then I asked, what did he think it would be like to be a woman watching that commercial? He was silent for a while, and then he said, not good. That was a deconstructing conversation, exposing something about discourses and their power. So from there, we could talk about what had happened in his relationships and how he didn't invent that way of relating, but that he did get caught up in it. After this conversation, Andy apologized to his ex-fiancée, and then he began thinking about what the possibilities were for relationships. He decided that he wanted to be different in relationships, that he didn't want to keep having this experience of women being disappointed and breaking the engagement with him. It wasn't easy to change long-standing habits, but this awareness of the effects of what he had done helped him think about and actually move into different ways of relating with women.
So dominant discourses include sort of the standard psychological discourses. Our normative ideas about families and individuals and categorizations that we use for diagnosis contribute to thin, problem-focused stories that don't reflect the many strands of possibilities for people's experiences. The practice of externalization, recognizing that people and problems are separate, is a narrative practice used to counter these psychological discourses. By naming a problem as separate from the people we work with, we can help people have a choice in how they relate to that problem. When we externalize the problem, people can see beyond it to other possibilities and appreciate other things about themselves. To illustrate this, we'll show you a clip from YouTube that we really like.
We love this video because it shows that once people see beyond the labels influenced by normalizing judgments, they're free to relate to other experiences and make other, more useful identity conclusions.
Michael White introduced this idea that the person is not the problem is the problem. The narrative practice of externalizing puts this idea into action. Just listening with the belief that problems are separate from people has a powerful effect. It biases us to interact differently than we would if we saw people as intrinsically problematic. As we listen to people's stories, we listen for the ways they refer to the problems in their lives. If we hear names like fear, or blowing up, temper tantrums, we orient to those things as entities or processes that are external to the people and that are acting on them in problematic ways. If we're not hearing names for problems, we might ask more directly for people to name the problems. We might say, when you say that something comes between you in those moments, what would you call that something? We can locate problems in discourses by asking externalizing questions about contextual influences on the problem. Questions like, what feeds the problem? What starts it? Who benefits from it? In what settings might the problematic attitude be useful? Which people would proudly advocate for this problem? What groups of people would definitely be opposed to it and to its intentions? Questions such as these invite people to consider how the entire context of their lives affects the problem, and vice versa. As problems are externalized, it becomes established that rather than being the problem, the person or couple or family has a relationship with the problem. People have the opportunity to describe their relationships with problems in a variety of ways and to revise that relationship. Another advantage of externalizing problems is that when people stop locating problems in each other, they can join together to oppose the problem.
We're particularly interested to hear descriptions of the effects of problems. When we ask about the effects of a problem on people's lives and on their relationships, it often mobilizes people to take a stand and oppose the problem. People can stop thinking about themselves or their relationships as inherently problematic and instead consider how they want to revise their relationships with problems. The process of naming can be poetic and compelling. We saw a young heterosexual couple in which the man described his problem as anxiety attacks. He said that they woke him in the middle of the night. When we asked him to further describe the problem, he said it was like a person holding a gun to his head and trying to steal his sleep. When we asked if he could give a name to this problem, he called it the thief. His partner, who had been scornful of the anxiety and difficulty sleeping until this point, could easily relate to the terror of burglary in the dark of night. She began to appreciate her partner's bravery in facing it alone. She suggested that he wake her so that she could help. As we ask people to evaluate their relationship to problems, they often tell us what they would prefer to have in their life in place of the problems. We are especially interested in hearing about preferred directions in life. We listen for words in people's descriptions that might serve as good names for their preferred directions. We ask questions that invite them to identify the directions and name them as projects. Then we can track, as stories are developing, how the projects are going.
And that's what a lot of narrative therapy becomes over time, is in each session, as we've identified a project, we're asking more questions to bring forth a richer and more vivid story of how the project started and where it's leading and what the effects of that is. And especially we want to ask about the meaning of all the things that are going on in therapy. So let's focus on meaning making a little bit. We'll let you read this cartoon for yourself. Most mornings we do get up and we go in our own lives. This is therapy in which we engage in meaning making. The stories that we have been talking about unfold in two realms. One has to do with just the events through time. What happened, what happened, what happened next. The second is the meaning we make of those events, the reflections we have about them. Meaning may relate to dreams, hopes, learnings, purposes in life, what one holds precious, the conclusions that people are making about their identity, and so on. When we ask someone to tell us the details of a story that wouldn't be predicted by the problematic story, we also ask them questions about the meaning of the new story. As people immerse themselves in these meanings, meanings that are different than the ones that they have made about the problematic story, new possibilities emerge that we wouldn't have been able to predict.
So in my work with Andy, the man who opened up the whole world of beer commercials to me, the apology he made to the woman who ended the engagement was an event I was interested in asking questions about and making meaning about. The reason I was interested in this was this event of his going back and making an apology was something that stood outside of that problematic storyline, and it seemed like an opening to an alternative story. So I asked about his preparation for the conversation, the thoughts he had about what he wanted to say and what he hoped would happen and what he was doing. I asked him about what he actually said, how the woman responded, what the look on her face was like. I also thought it was really important to invite him to reflect on this event of having made the apology and to make some meaning about it. So here are the kinds of questions that we might ask to make meaning. What does it say about you that you took this step? If you were to describe this as a step towards something, what would you say it was a step toward? Would you say that what you did fit with things that are important to you in life? Can you name what those things are? Can you tell me what you've learned? How is that important?
Besides asking meaning questions about stories that wouldn't be predicted by the problematic story, we also wonder about the absent but implicit meaning in people's responses to problems. That is, we assume that things become problematic for people in contrast to something that they would prefer, something that they want different than what's happening. That means that we can think of descriptions of problems as implying something important that's been frustrated or betrayed or lost. We'll give an example from a family interview of this kind of inquiring about the absent but implicit.
So initially, this work began as therapy with an individual. Connie consulted me about a family problem. Connie came to see me when she discovered that her son Alan was getting married and that she hadn't been invited to the wedding. She told me that she had been in an abusive marriage and had divorced 15 years previously. To her great sorrow, her ex-husband was awarded full custody of their only child, Alan. Although legally, Connie had visitation rights, most of the time when Connie tried to pick up Alan for a visit, he refused to go. And he would rarely even come to the phone for a one-sided conversation. Connie's hopes that their relationship would be reconstituted were something that she held on for years, but these hopes were dashed when she was not invited to the wedding. She described herself to me as a bad mother for leaving the marriage. Now, looking back 15 years later, she thought that she should have stayed in the marriage just to be continuing the relationship with her son. And she thought that she must be a bad mother for being someone her only son was not willing to relate to. So we did many things as part of this therapy, but I'm just going to tell you about one. And that was that Connie wrote a letter to Alan, her hopes and wishes and love for him. Since it had been so clear that he wasn't interested in communicating with her, having returned any kinds of letters that had been sent before, she did not send this letter. But the process of writing it was so helpful to her that she committed to writing to Alan weekly, sharing her love for him and some of the experiences of her life. She kept all of these letters with hopes of a future in which she could share them. 16 years later, Connie came to see me again. She told me that Alan and his family lived in New York, but that Alan's daughter Elizabeth, who was now in high school, had a good friend who had moved to Chicago. And on a visit to see this friend, Elizabeth called Connie, her grandmother, and they were able to arrange to meet and spend an afternoon together. After that, they had emails and phone conversations, and Elizabeth had arranged another visit in which she saw her grandmother again. After this second visit, Elizabeth went home and told her father about the meetings with Connie, hoping that when she described what this meant to her, that this would spur a family reconciliation. Instead, Alan was outraged and forbid Elizabeth to stay in touch with Connie. So when Connie told me about this, I called Alan, hoping to facilitate a family conversation. And although when I had made a similar call 16 years earlier, he had not agreed to this time he did agree to meet with me and said that he did not want his daughter Elizabeth to be at that meeting. But he did come, and at that meeting, Alan expressed his anger at Connie for meeting Elizabeth behind his back. He also said that he shouldn't be surprised since Connie never cared about him. Connie said she had always cared. Alan asked how he could possibly believe that. Sitting by her side, Connie had a very large tote, which she then pulled forward and opened. It was filled with stacks of her cards and letters that she had arranged chronologically. She offered them to him. With encouragement, he took out a letter, took it out of the envelope, and began to read it. And as he did, Connie explained how for the last 16 years she had done her best in emotionally staying connected to him through regularly writing him letters. Alan read this single letter, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope back in the tote, and pushed the whole thing back towards Connie, frowning. I asked, "What was your experience reading that letter?" "Anger," Alan said. Connie slumped in her chair in what I thought was disappointment. "Can you tell me about the anger?" I asked. He said, "So much time lost." I asked him, time for what was lost? And he said, to have a mother, to know she cared. Dad said she didn't. She left us all. So I said, the anger is a testament to how important this relationship is? Yes, he answered, now beginning to tear up. Yes. This was the beginning of a new relationship between Alan and Connie. I don't want to suggest that there were not problems, because there were, but the letters made a contribution to filling in the gaps. Also, the understanding of Alan's anger as a testament to the importance of the relationship he thought had been lost was important. And Connie was able to reclaim her identity as a good mother. This therapy conversation offered the opportunity to restory an experience based on new meaning. For Connie, the meaning of Alan's anger and subsequent avoidance of her now spoke to how precious the relationship he thought he had lost was to him. And understanding this allowed her to make a different meaning of herself as a good mother, about her identity.
So I want to talk a bit now about identity as a relational project. We don't think of identity as a fixed thing. We don't try to help people get in touch with their deep, true, authentic selves. We view identity as relational, distributed, performed, and fluid. By relational, we mean that our stories of who we have been and who we can be wouldn't exist outside of our relationships with other people. They're shaped by our experiences with others and our sense of how others perceive us. By distributed, we mean that the stories and experiences that shape our moment-by-moment sense of self are located in different places. Stories and experiences that support our sense of self are distributed in other people's memories, in hospital records, in graffiti, in the Facebook pages of high school friends, and in many other places. At times, stories from several of these places can come together to solidify a particular sense of identity. At other times, stories from different sources can give a sense of multiple possible identities. One's associates at work may describe a different person than would the members of that same person's once-a-month poker club. And the members of the grade school soccer team that that person coaches may see and describe and experience yet a different person. When we say that our sense of self is performed, we mean that we are all participants in each other's ongoing dramas. Each of us is always a performer and an audience at the same time. On the one hand, we become who we act like we are. We constitute ourselves through the choices we make. On the other, we're shaped by the responses and expectations of those around us. Our notions of how we can act in a given event are influenced by our memories of how people have responded in similar past events, and by which particular people are present in the current episode.
This relational, distributed, performed self is also fluid. It is not the deep, true, authentic, sort of stable self proposed by structuralism. It happens between people and is always changing, although there's also a trace that runs through all the stories of our history. One implication of this fluid sense of self is that change is practically impossible to avoid. Rather than trying to help people be true to themselves, we can focus on different experiences of self, either help people choose the relationships, contexts, and commitments that support their preferred ways of being, or help them bring other aspects of themselves into problematic contexts in ways that will change their experience. We think of identity as a project that can be expressed by the question, how are we becoming other than who we have already been? This is a question that Michael White got from Michel Foucault, and we think of it as sort of the central guiding question of much of narrative therapy. In contrast to the more traditional therapy question of who am I?
I want to tell you about an interview with a heterosexual couple, Jesse and Diana. The man in the couple had been very ill with heart failure and very advanced diabetes for 12 years. He was so ill that he actually died a few months after the interview I'm telling you about. Jesse and Diana were consulting me about the difficulty of living with this illness. They felt that it was taking their relationship away. Their son had recently been married in a huge ceremony in a different city. For months before the wedding, both partners worried about whether Jesse would be able to handle the plane trip and the many stresses of the wedding and the rehearsal dinner and the reception. And he was determined to go. They were both worried that the reception would be too much, and before they went, they had made plans for Jesse to go back to the hotel immediately after the ceremony. In the interview we're focusing on, Jesse and Diana had just returned. At the beginning of this time together, they were both extremely tired and really discouraged. Jesse was exhausted from the trip, And he was cussing in an uncharacteristic way, using the F word a lot and saying, damn it, this is just no way to live. And then they both just kind of sunk into this funk and weren't saying very much. I was kind of wondering where we could go with that, and thought I'd see what would happen if I started asking them some more about the wedding. And with my questions, they began to tell me a little bit more about the trip and how it had gone. As things progressed, Diana described how Jesse had gone not only to the ceremony, but also to the reception. And then, to her shock, using his walker, not his wheelchair, he had made his way all the way to the microphone at the front of the hall and made his speech. He made the speech standing up for 10 minutes. Well, I asked Diana for some more details about this. Jesse, who'd been sitting slumped over in his wheelchair, then got to hear Diana describe how handsome he had looked as he made the speech, how poetic he was, and how proud she was of him. When I asked Jesse what it was like to hear Diana describe him in this way, he said, it was intoxicating. So I asked some more questions. And both Jesse and Diana then were able to reflect in answering these questions that Jesse's presence had not been diminished by the illness, that he'd been very much there. Not only did they recognize this, but in response to the questions, they recognized that the whole family had recognized this, and that all the guests had gotten to see Jesse shine. In response to even more questions, Jesse described their listening to the speech and his thinking that they must be thinking, look at him run. I thought that was quite a statement concerning a man who was confined to a wheelchair. Through the telling and reflecting on this story, Jesse was able to re-own important aspects of his identity. Celebrating their relationship with their son and with each other and reflecting on the details and meaning of the experience gave Jesse and Diana a new, vital, hopeful sense of themselves.
Yeah, and that's worth the bark from a dog. So we want to emphasize two aspects of this story. First is the initiative that Jesse took by making the speech, and that they were able to revisit in the therapy conversation. At the beginning of the interview, both Jesse and Diana were talking about the horror of the illness and how it was no way to live. Jesse's initiative could have been lost. Jean could have said, great that you made it through the reception, and they could have all gone back to talking about the horrible effects of the illness. Instead, Jean recognized that Jesse had taken an initiative, and that the initiative offered the possibility of Jesse seeing and telling about and experiencing himself as someone other than a very sick and tired person. Look at him run. Through reflecting on his initiative, Jesse began to perceive himself as someone who could enjoy himself, someone who could come through in spite of great odds, someone who was a great speech giver, and someone who was a family man, connected to friends and celebrating life. And this new sense of identity spilled over into the possibilities for the relationship. That Diana said, maybe this means that things can be different now.
And she was able to hang on to those stories, and they were very meaningful to her in the time after Jesse died as well. The other thing we hope this story illustrates is a relational or multi-voiced sense of identity. The work of Barbara Meyerhoff, a cultural anthropologist, inspired Michael White to think of life as a membered club and of identity as something we experience in association with others. It matters who sees us, and it matters how they see us. The story of Jesse's wedding triumph was told by both Jesse and Diana. It was witnessed by Diana. and by a whole range of family and friends. It was through questions inviting each of them to hear the reflections of the other that Jesse reclaimed and expanded his identity, and that Diana heard the importance of her view to her partner. Questions such as these were important in this relational sense of identity. What did you appreciate about him? What did people recognize? What did this say about what was important? What did it mean? What was it like to hear that? What did it mean to have Diana see you this way? Near the end of the story, Jesse and Diana agreed that when they were immersed in the story, the problem was not in the room. I would add that a different version of Jesse and of their relationship was in the room.
As narrative therapists, we are serious about this multi-voice sense of identity. For that reason, in addition to inviting people to join the therapy in family or group conversations, or as outsider witnesses or reflecting team members, we also often document our work and share the documents with other people who are working towards similar purposes. In our work as therapists, the documents we most often use are letters, which we write with the understanding and hope that they might be shared. So I'm just going to read you a letter I wrote to an 8-year-old boy after a meeting with his family. Dear Gabriel, it was a pleasure to meet you today. I'm sorry that I didn't understand just how difficult the friendship problem is until you were leaving. I wonder if your bravery kept me from seeing how hard it is. The reason I say bravery is that you've been going to school even though you feel so much hurt there. I wonder how you've been able to keep going to school even though the friendship problem makes it feel like a hurtful place. Would you call it courage that helps you do this, or something else? Do you think the courage, or whatever you would call it, can help you with these last 2 weeks of school? Also, having to be in your classroom for so much of the day where the friendship problem really hurts, you've still managed to keep it in the class and not let it affect things outside of the class. For example, you haven't let it keep you from friends in different classes, or from playing football at recess, or from your other sports. You haven't let it keep you from enjoying the drums and trumpets and learning Spanish. Some kids, when they have friendship problems like the one you described, lose their sense of enjoying other things, but you keep enjoying your friends and playing music and the Cubs and playing sports. How have you kept the friendship problem from creeping into these other parts of your life? Can you see how, to me, this shows that you're interested in controlling your life instead of the friendship problem controlling your life, and that you've had some success with that? You told me that you have 5 good friends at school: Daniel, Brady, Ryan, Andrew, and Colton. I wonder what these friends would say if they heard the making fun of things that some of the kids in your class say. Whose words do you want to hear in your mind? The words of your 5 friends, or the words of the kids making fun? If you could hear one thing from your 5 friends whenever there is a making fun of face or comment, what would it be? Gabriel, I'm sorry we can't talk sooner because I can see that this problem really hurts. But maybe some of these questions might help us figure some things out, and maybe you are doing better with the problem than you realize. Yours against being made fun of, Jill. Now this letter not only was a letter to Gabriel, but it was a letter that was subsequently offered insider knowledge to other young people struggling with friendship problems, that helped them get in touch with how it could be contained in a certain place, how they could hear the voices of their friends instead of the making fun of voices, and how there were other things they could take joy in and have courage about, even if there was this kind of friendship problem. Also, the stories that we've shared with you this morning are documents. It makes a difference to the people whose stories you've heard today to know that we will be sharing them with you. They hope that their stories are meaningful to you and that they contribute something to your learning.
We'd like to go back to that question, how are we becoming other than who we've already been? And draw your attention to the we. Narrative therapy is, as I'm sure is true of the therapy most people here listening practice, it's not just a one-way account. We're different for being in on the stories like the ones we've shared today. And we hope that in some small way, everybody else that's still here with us is too.
Okay, so we are open for questions and conversation with you.
Excellent, you guys.
Thank you.
We want to thank Mary Ann Wambolt for sharing details of her personal life with us that she may not even be aware of.
I actually think she went off the webinar at some point. Jean, you could stop showing your screen, and that way I can see you and you can see me. So I'm loving your stories. Of course, you know that. I hope you know that. Are you off screen yet?
I don't think so.
I'm working on it.
There, I think.
Here we go. Did that work?
Perfect.
How's that?
Figured it out. That's great. That's great. So I've got one question that came in, so I'll start with that one question. It was in right after you showed that wonderful YouTube video that I also love and show a lot. This person is Mallory from Philadelphia, and she says, "Managed care doesn't allow us to stop labeling." I just lost the question. Doesn't allow us to stop labeling. I totally appreciate the message of the video and feel it is immensely valuable, helpful, correct. But we are stuck in this negative cycle as professionals. How do we break out of this as a narrative therapist? I get this question, a similar question from students all the time, so I can hardly wait to hear your response.
Well, you know, we live in a world where our idealism, you know, goes smack up against some things like in the system where I work, we have an electronic medical record. It won't let me out of a note on somebody until I've clicked the box that gives them a diagnosis. So it's not like I'm able to avoid giving these kinds of labels to people. I think it matters a whole lot how seriously we hold these labels and how seriously we invite the and a lot of times it's just a pretty frank discussion about in order for your insurance to pay for it, in order for me to do the record, I, you know, got to assign something, and there's even a discussion about what shall we assign you.
So, and I was a consultant for an agency that I thought came up with a really great idea, and that was to separate the sort of assessment diagnostic part from the therapy part, so that they had people meet with one person for one part, and it was a totally separate relationship. And then the therapy relationship, the therapist didn't even have to know about that. So it was really that separation made a huge difference for them.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was thinking that when you don't have that option, one of the ways I think about it is I try to separate myself from that problem. So,
How do you do that, Vicki?
I think of it as a problem to separate myself from. That
Yes.
I have to do that on one part, and on the other part I think differently. So,
Yeah.
So here's a question from Stephen in Philadelphia. He says, can you comment on not knowing and the role of language, parentheses, words, used by clients in narrative therapy? It sounds more like Harlene's dialogical approach, but it's relevant, I think. So it's all yours.
Well, that metaphor of not knowing, I think, is meaningful to some narrative therapists and not to others. And I think it can be easily misunderstood. I mean, there are things that we know about the process, about asking questions. what's best for a particular thing that I'm working with. And sometimes using that way of thinking about it helps remind me that my job has something to do with facilitating a question and asking about things that have not yet been put into words, rather than having an idea that I've developed about where we're going. So I find it somewhat useful. I know some people think there's too much misunderstanding in it.
Yeah, I'm going to throw a big word out. It's a word I like. The word is epistemology. It has to do with the study of how we know what we know. And so I think the notion of knowing and questioning what it is that we think we know is very important. And that's where we get into that whole stuff about discourses that we try to give people at least a little flavor of in the talk. And I think it's important to know that whatever it is we think we know, there's some set of discourses that we're leaning on, that we're supported by in that particular kind of knowing. And I think the kind of not knowing we would want to align ourselves with is not knowing which discourse is going to be most useful to somebody else who's coming to consult us, and always trying to be as aware as we can of not getting stuck in a particular set of discourses and being blind to other possibilities for people's lives.
And what was the part about language?
Let me pull it up again. The role of language used by clients in narrative therapy.
Well, I think we offer some linguistic challenges. So then when we ask people to name something in a particular way, I think how we language things is really important. And I don't know if this is the intent of the question, but one of the things that brings to mind for me is that I'm not interested in teaching people who come to see me to think in the same way I do. So they may be talking about something that doesn't fit with the way I would think about it, but I'm more interested in finding out how that contributes to a preferred story that we can talk more about, or can we take it apart if it doesn't. So for me, I do want to invite people to think in externalizing language, but a lot of other language, it really has to do with whether it's supporting a problem or a project.
And we want to try, at least in the beginning, to be close to other people's experience and to understand their experience from their experience. So that means we want to, in many ways, use their language and notice their particular language and not insist that they use our language, which is not to say that we wouldn't occasionally use some very unusual language just to invite them into a different way of looking at something.
Here's another question from Jeremy in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Is this type of therapy more effective within cultures with a strong tradition of storytelling, that is Native American or Hispanic, and is it more readily received within these cultures?
I don't really know that anybody has researched this. What I can say is that in Australia, there's this, I'm going to get this wrong, but I know that there's reimbursement, and that somebody in charge of the way things are funded has decided for Aboriginal people it's so fitting that there is way more, it's much easier to get funded using this kind of therapy with Aboriginal people than Anglo people. I do have the experience that people from some other cultures where there's the strong storytelling and particularly different ideas about identity that are more relational instead of individualistic, really relate. This is just what I've seen a lot of people respond on personally, that it really is fitting for them. So I think in a lot of places, like if I could just give an example, in China, there's been a whole lot of teaching of Western kinds of therapy. And when I've talked about relational identity, it's sort of like there's this whole layer of individualism that's been learned through the colonizing process of teaching therapy. I'm not saying that I'm not involved in that process. I think it's, it's tricky. But when I've taught about relational identity in that context, people sort of have often responded, wow, that really fits much more with the way we've always thought about identity rather than what we've learned through these psychological process teachings. So I think that's an interesting question, and more could be researched about it.
I'll just say, at the risk of being hypercritical, that we also just want to be cautious about making any kind of sweeping generalizations about our own culture or anybody else's culture. So to speak of storytelling cultures and non-storytelling cultures is the kind, is the kind of generalization we'd want to be cautious about, because each of us is a culture to ourselves in a certain way, and there are ways that I fit and don't fit with the Appalachian hillbilly culture that I was raised in, for instance.
So here's a clinical question for you. This is from Dove, who's in Los Angeles, is working with a couple who are trying to separate well, and it has emerged that for many years the husband was forcing his wife to have sex, and she identifies this as the cause of her need to exit the marriage. He experiences a great deal of shame around this, and at the same time is defensive, as he says, quote, I didn't realize it was wrong. It was what I learned about being a guy. Suggestions for questions for unpacking this past violence in service of their current wish to become good friends and work well together in raising their children.
Yeah. I actually worked with a heterosexual couple that I could have described in almost the same way. And it did make a difference for the woman to witness questions to the man about, like, what made him think that it wasn't wrong, like what's he become aware of now that he wasn't aware of then, what kinds of models, messages. I think what can happen through finding out sort of the history of learning about being a guy in this way is that it becomes externalized. Yeah. And that once it's externalized, it's not totalizing of that man. I mean, it doesn't dismiss the experience that the woman has had, but they can look at it as not having to do with something essential about his identity, but rather a set of practices and ideas that he was recruited into. And that might create enough room to help them establish relations. For the people I worked with, what was most important is that they could establish a respectful relationship with each other as co-parents. I don't know if that's in this situation.
So just to come at it from a slightly different angle, I'm thinking there's kind of two general kinds of questions that would be useful to ask. One is just that all those questions that would help him identify whatever equals beer commercials for him, if we go back to Jill's example from the talk, so that his partner could hear also about the cultural influences that were blinding him to what it was. And then there's also questions with the story of how he came to see that there was another way.
I think it's echoing.
No, I don't think it's got it.
Okay.
We've got some kind of feedback.
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody's hearing.
It comes and goes. It comes and goes.
But it's driving me nuts. But The if he can see that he has changed, then you can ask the story if he's understand. And it's in contrast with the way he is now. And his partner story of that change. That those would also be.
So we have about, I don't know, 5 or 8 minutes. I have one more question, which is just a simple sort of logistical question. Several people asked, and I meant to ask you at the beginning, if they could have a PDF of your PowerPoint. Were you wanting to send that to us to send on to people who want it?
Jean has to think about.
I think we can.
I think that we'll take out the video, but on YouTube. YouTube.
Right. Just maybe put in the URL for the video.
Okay.
Yeah. So and I'd like it. So there you go. I'd like to have it too.
So we'll send it on to you next day or so.
Okay. I have to say, because I do a fair amount when I do teach narrative therapy now, it's sort of teaching beginners, teaching people who are unused to the ideas. And I learned so much from the two of you about how I can begin to vary what I'm doing and enrich it. So maybe I'll just take you. I'll take you in my pocket with me when I go.
I'd like to show one more time, just contact information.
Oh, okay. But you're not the presenter. So go back to, maybe Chris can go back and make you the presenter again for a minute. I'm the presenter because I'm going to show stuff. So.
Okay. So show my screen.
Yeah, show my screen.
While you're doing that, I'm going to show, this is the other book. This is the couple book. I think everyone can see that. This is Narrative Therapy with Couples and a Whole Lot More. So that's another little commercial. And when Jill and Jean show their contact information, then I'll show you how to access their article.
Now it's completely
lost everything.
You've lost everything. You just have to open your PowerPoint, I think, if it's on your is it on your PowerPoint?
Yes, it's the last thing.
I think you just have to open your PowerPoint. I'm trying to remotely help you.
Yes, I know you are. Everybody's left. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Okay.
Go to PowerPoint. There you go. There you go. Perfect. So this is how you get a hold of Jill and Jean at the Evanston Family Therapy Center. You need to tell me. Are we good here? You need to also tell me who to send the check to. But I'm gonna ask Chris to make me the presenter again, so I can show you. I can show our attendees how to access your article. All right. Show my screen. Is my screen being shown? No?
Yes, well, I see it.
You see it? All right, everyone see it? I see it. So if you want to access the Family Process Journal, go to whatever search engine you use and just type in Family Process. It'll come up immediately, Family Process Wiley Online Library. Click on that, and it will take you to Family Process Wiley Online Library homepage, which is here. The current issue, the June issue, is now available. If you want to find Jill and Jean's articles, all you need to do is type in one of their names. I'm typing in Jill's name. You see that's under the search function for the journal. You go to that. And it will show you, actually it shows you an article I've written first, and it probably shows that because I write about some of Jill's work in that article. That article will also be available for you to download for free for 30 days after this webinar. And here's the one that Jill and Jean wrote, Narrative Ideas for Consulting with Communities and Organizations, Ripples from the Gatherings. This article is written. Go ahead, Jill.
Can I yours is
we're losing your audio.
I was just trying to say that's a fantastic article.
Thank you. I'm glad we got the audio back. That's great. Thank you. This article by Jill and Jean was written for a special section, a Legacy of Michael White section that was written about a year after Michael died. It's a wonderful article. They also have an article in process for a special section on narrative therapy that will appear in Family Process likely in March 2016. The other thing I want to say is that there will be this particular webinar will be available on the Family Process 1 YouTube channel, which I'm going to now. And if we look at this, you will see that there's an FPI, hashtag FPI webinars playlist. We have the last one up here by Ruben Potter Cardona. Jill and Jean's will then show up in a day or so. I will have that up there. The other thing that I want to make sure I say is that Family Process Institute is now in partnership with the Ackerman Institute, and we are creating a series of webinars that will start and will be in the fall and the winter. And I just want to tell you what's coming up. In September, we have Carmen Knudsen Martin talking about undoing gendered power in heterosexual couple relationships. We have Michelle Shankman, cultivating intimacies in couples therapy. That's in October. In November, we have Thandawi D. Watts-Jones, social location and therapy. And in December, we have Janine Roberts, therapist self-disclosure. We have something for January and February also, but those aren't ready to be seen yet. So I am going to stop showing my screen and come back and say goodbye to Jill and Jean, if I can see them here in a minute. I now see them.
Yay.
You guys, thanks so much.